Hiya, 8. You have made it to the last chapter, chapter 10. So well done. Great job. If you've got the notes down for all of the 10 chapters, you have done so well. So really give yourselves a pat on the back. You should be really proud of your efforts. So today's chapter, again, Animal Farm, this time chapter 10. The date I've put is Tuesday the 28th of April, as that is the day that this video will be shared on ePraise. So once you've got the title and the date down, your first task today is to write down your predictions for this chapter. And on my page, to fit all of the notes into onto one page, I've allowed 4 lines for that. I don't think it will take any more. So pause the video when you've laid out your page and you have written down your predictions, and then we will be moving on to the vocabulary that you need for this chapter. So, the vocabulary I'd like you to have, so I've started just below those 4 lines that I have allowed. So we start with regime. So regime is essentially a system of leadership, so it's usually used to describe a government. Corrupt is, so you might remember from Oliver, a corrupt person is dishonest and acts immorally for personal gain. Somebody who is prosperous makes lots of money. A prosperous business makes lots of money. So number 3 is prosperous. Number 4 is suppress. Suppress. So if you suppress something, you forcibly end it. Or it can be used as well to sort of show how you're holding people back or holding them down. Okay, so a suppressed population, the government, the regime, may put an end to certain rights that they're entitled to, and in doing so, that holds them back. Okay, so pause the video to get those 4 down if you need to. And then there's another 3 that we're going to cover that are just for your memory. So we've got tyrant, rebellion, and revolution. So pop down those 3 words and then try from memory to give definitions of them, and then check back through your notes to find the definitions from the past and correct in green pen if necessary. Okay, so pause the video if you need to, and then we're going to look back to your predictions. So at the top of the page, you put your predictions, and I'm not just going to tell you exactly what happens in the chapter, but what I am going to tell you is what you're going to see happening. So not events, but just sort of what you'll see happening within that community. So you're going to see how often a revolution not only replaces a regime, but often becomes just like the regime it replaces. So think back to Jones's regime, the way that Jones ruled the farm, and has that fed into your predictions? Have we seen the pigs becoming more and more like Jones? Is this going to be complete in this chapter? You're going to see how those who seize power can use it to suppress others. So remember, the whole vision that old Major had at the start was one of fairness and equality and working together. Have the pigs who seized power, have they allowed for that, or have they suppressed others? And how power can corrupt. Say all the animals started, it seemed, with very wholesome intentions. Old Major, who encouraged the rebellion, was a pig. But look what has happened to the pigs once power has taken hold and corrupted them. Okay, so pause the video if you need to get those notes down and to lay out the final bit of your page, which is going to be for this chapter's key events and quotes. Okay, pause the video if you need to, and then we will start reading the final chapter. So, chapter 10 can be found on page 92 and 93. Years passed. The seasons came and went. The short animal lives fled by. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion, except Clover, Benjamin, Moses the raven, and a number of the pigs. Muriel was dead. Bluebell, Jessie and Pincher were dead. Jones too was dead. He had died in an inebriate's home in another part of the country. So an inebriate's home, that would be like a home for alcoholics, I believe. Snowball was forgotten. Boxer was forgotten, except for by the few who had known him. Clover was an old stout mare now, stiff in the joints and with a tendency to rheumy eyes. That's just watery eyes. She was 2 years past the retiring age, but in fact, no animal had ever actually retired, so those promises have not been kept. The talk of setting aside a corner of the pasture for the superannuated animals had long since been dropped. Remember, that means like pensioned off animals. Napoleon was now a mature boar of 24 stone. Squealer was so fat that he could with difficulty see out of his eyes. So the animals are actually, we're going to discover, being rationed really heavily. The other animals are not quite starving, but they're certainly not being fed enough for them to be healthy. Meanwhile, you've got the pigs and the leadership, those in leadership, the pigs and the dogs, have gained weight. The two sort of most prominent pigs of Napoleon and Squealer have gained so much weight that they are morbidly obese, all the while whilst there are other animals on the farms starving. Only old Benjamin was much the same as ever, except for being a little greyer about the muzzle, and, since Boxer's death, more morose and taciturn than ever. So if you're morose, you're sort of sulky and bad-tempered, and if you're taciturn, you're very quiet, you're not at all talkative. And we know that Benjamin has always been quite a cynical character, has always been quiet, has always been quite bad-tempered, arguably with reason. But now he's more morose, more taciturn than ever. There were many more characters on the farm. There were many more creatures on the farm now, though the increase was not so great as had been expected in earlier years. Many animals had been born to whom the rebellion was only a dim tradition, passed on by word of mouth, and others had been bought who had never heard mention of such a thing before their arrival. The farm possessed 3 horses now besides Clover. They were fine upstanding beasts, willing workers and good comrades, but were very stupid. None of them proved able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B. So that's intentional, isn't it? That's what the pigs have done. They've brought in animals who are strong, but are not that bright, because they're not going to argue with them. They're not going to question the regime. They accepted everything they were told about the rebellion and the principles of animalism, especially from Clover, for whom they had an almost filial respect. So if you have a filial respect, you have a loyalty for somebody almost as if you see them as a parental figure. But it was doubtful whether they understood much of it. The farm was more prosperous now and better organised. It had been enlarged by 2 fields which had been bought from Mr. Pilkington. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a hay elevator of its own, and various new buildings had been added to it. Whymper bought himself a dog cart. That's just a cart drawn by dogs. The windmill, however, had not been used for the generating of electrical power. They had used it for milling corn and brought in a handsome money profit. The animals were hard at work building yet another windmill when that one was finished, so it was said. The dynamos would be installed. But the luxuries of which Snowball had once taught the animals to dream, the stalls with electric light and hot and cold water, the 3-day week, were no longer talked about. Napoleon had denounced such ideas as contrary to the spirit of animalism, so he's publicly declared that those ideas, that animals could live in comfort, were wrong and actually go against animalism. To denounce something is to publicly declare it to be wrong. The truest happiness, he said, lay in working hard and living frugally. So if you live frugally, you live money sparingly. You've got to think, if that's the truest happiness in life, working hard and living frugally, are the pigs doing that? Is it truly the root of happiness, or is it just something they're using to brainwash these animals into continuing to do what they want? Somehow, it seemed as though the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer, except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs. Perhaps this was partly because there were so many pigs and so many dogs. It was not that these creatures did not work after their fashion. There was, as Squealer never tired of explaining, endless work. So, maybe before we turn the page, it's a good time to get the first couple of bullet points down. So, many years pass and more animals die and new ones are bought and bred. And that means that the rebellion has been largely forgotten. Okay, so pause the video for a moment, get those couple of notes down, and then we'll carry on with the next page. So yeah, Squealer had explained that there was lots of work in the supervision and organisation of the farm. Much of this work was of a kind that other animals were too ignorant to understand. For example, Squealer told them that the pigs had to expend enormous labours every day upon mysterious things called files, reports, minutes and memoranda. These were large sheets of paper which had to be closely covered with writing, and as soon as they were so covered, they were burnt in the furnace. This was of the highest importance for the welfare of the farm, Squealer said. But still, neither pigs nor dogs produced any food by their own labour, and there were many of them, and their appetites were always good. As for the others, their life, so far as they knew, was as it had always been. They were generally hungry. They slept on straw, they drank from the pool, they laboured in the fields. In the winter they were troubled by the cold, and in the summer by the flies. Sometimes the older ones among them racked their dim memories and tried to determine whether in the early days of the rebellion, when Jones's expulsion was still recent, things had been better or worse than now. They could not remember. There was nothing with which they could compare their present lives. They had nothing to go on except Squealer's lists of figures, which invariably demonstrated that everything was getting better and better. The animals found the problem insoluble, so impossible to solve. In any case, they had little time for speculating on such things now. Only old Benjamin professed to remember every detail of his long life and to know that things had never been, nor ever could be, much better or much worse. Hunger, hardship and disappointment being, so he said, the unalterable law of life. So unalterable, unchanged, unchangeable. And yet the animals never gave up hope. More, they never lost, even for an instant, their sense of honour and privilege in being members of Animal Farm. They were still the only farm in the whole country, in all England, who was owned and operated by animals. Not one of them, not even the youngest, not even the newcomers who had been bought from farms 10 or 20 miles away, ever ceased to marvel at that. And when they heard the gun booming and saw the green flag fluttering at the masthead, their hearts swelled with imperishable pride, so everlasting pride. And the talk turned always towards the old heroic days, the expulsion of Jones, the writing of the 7 Commandments, the great battles in which the human invaders had been defeated. None of the old dreams had been abandoned. The Republic of the Animals, which Major had foretold, when the green fields of England should be untrodden by human feet, was still believed in. Some day it was coming. It might not be soon. It might not be within the lifetime of any animal now living, but still it was coming. Even the tune of Beasts of England was perhaps hummed secretly here and there. At any rate, it was a fact that every animal on the farm knew it, though no one would have dared sing it aloud. It might be that their lives were hard, and that not all of the hopes had been fulfilled, but they were conscious that they were not as other animals. If they went hungry, it was not from feeding tyrannical human beings. If they worked hard, at least they worked for themselves. No creature among them went upon 2 legs. No creature called another creature master. All animals were equal. One day in early summer, Squealer ordered the sheep to follow him and led them out to a piece of wasteland at the other end of the farm, which had become overgrown with birch saplings. The sheep spent the whole day there browsing at the leaves under Squealer's supervision. In the evening, he returned to the farmhouse himself, but as it was warm weather, told the sheep to stay where they were. It ended by their remaining there for a whole week, during which time the other animals saw nothing of them. Squealer was with them for the greater part of the day. He was, he said, teaching them to sing a new song, for which privacy was needed. It was just after the sheep had returned, on a pleasant evening when the animals had finished work and were making their way back to the farm buildings, that the terrified neighing of a horse sounded from the yard. Startled, the animals stopped in their tracks. It was Clover's voice. She neighed again, and all the animals broke into a gallop and rushed into the yard. Then they saw what Clover had seen. It was a pig walking on his hind legs. So now the pigs are walking like humans. They're walking on 2 legs. Yes, it was Squealer. A little awkwardly, as though not quite used to supporting his considerable bulk in that position, but with perfect balance, he was strolling across the yard. And a moment later, out from the door of the farmhouse, came a long file of pigs, all walking on their hind legs. Some did it better than others. 1 or 2 were even a trifle unsteady and looked as though they would have liked the support of a stick, but every one of them had made his way right round the yard successfully. And finally, there was a tremendous baying of dogs and a shrill crowing from the black cockerel, and out came Napoleon himself, majestically upright, casting haughty glances from side to side, and with his dogs gambolling around him. Okay, haughty is to be sort of arrogant and stuck up. He's looking down on all the others because he now has the superiority of being on 2 legs. Just think back, that definition of gambolling, the running and jumping excitedly. He carried a whip in his trotter. Okay, so that whip is also symbolic. Remember, the first act of the animals when they had won the rebellion was to burn all of the implements of torture that the humans had used on them, and now the pigs are using them themselves. There was a deadly silence. Amazed, terrified, huddling together, the animals watched the long line of pigs march slowly round the yard. It was as though the world had turned upside down. Then there was a moment when the first shock had worn off, and when, in spite of everything, in spite of their terror of the dogs and out of habit, developed through long years of never complaining, never criticising, no matter what happened, they might have uttered some word of protest. But just at that moment, as though a signal, all the sheep burst off into a tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs better, 4 legs good, 2 legs better, 4 legs good, 2 legs better. It went on for 5 minutes without stopping. And by the time the sheep had quieted down, the chance to utter any protest had passed, for the pigs had marched back into the farmhouse. Okay, next couple of bullet points even. So, we've got the pigs start walking around on 2 legs and carrying whips, and that the pigs are taught a new maxim: 4 legs good, 2 legs better. So, pause the video, pop those notes down, and then we'll carry on with the chapter. Benjamin felt a nose nuzzling at his shoulder. He looked round. It was Clover. Her old eyes looked dimmer than ever. Without saying anything, she tugged gently at his mane and led him round the end of the big barn where the 7 commandments were written. For a moment or 2 they stood gazing at the tarred wall with its white lettering. "My sight is failing," she said finally. "Even when I was young I could have not read what was written there. But it appears to me that the wall looks different. Are the 7 commandments the same as they used to be, Benjamin?" For once Benjamin consented to break his rule, and he read out to her what was written on the wall. There was nothing there now except a single commandment. It ran, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." Okay, that is our next bullet point. Benjamin and Clover discover that the 7 commandments have been altered to just one. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Okay, so the pigs all along have changed these rules to suit them until there really is only one rule. Okay, so pause the video, get that down, and then we'll carry on. After that, it did not seem strange when the next day the pigs who were supervising the work of the farm all carried whips in their trotters. It did not seem strange to learn that the pigs had bought themselves a wireless set, it's like a radio, and were arranging to install a telephone and take out subscriptions to John Bull, Titbits and the Daily Mirror. I don't know what the first 2 are, but Daily Mirror is a newspaper, so I imagine that the other 2 are similar. This was written in the 40s, so just publications I think that probably don't exist anymore, but still, reading material, news, connecting them to the outside world. It did not seem strange when Napoleon was seen strolling in the farmhouse garden with a pipe in his mouth. No, not even when the pigs took Mr. Jones's clothes out of the wardrobes and put them on, Napoleon himself appearing in a black coat, rat-catcher breeches and leather leggings. while his favourite sow appeared in a watered silk dress which Mrs. Jones had used to wear on Sundays. Okay, so the pig's now wearing the clothes as well. A week later in the afternoon, a number of dog carts drove up to the farm. A deputation of neighbouring farmers had been invited to take a tour of inspection. It's just like a group of representatives from different farms. They were shown all over the farm and expressed great admiration for everything they saw, especially the windmill. The animals were weeding the turnip field. They worked diligently, hardly raising their faces from the ground and not knowing whether to be more frightened of the pigs or the human voices. So if you're working diligently, you're working really hard, but with real care as well, care and attention. That evening, loud laughter and bursts of singing came from the farmhouse. And suddenly, I'm not holding this very steady, I'm sorry. That evening, loud laughter and bursts of singing came from the farmhouse. And suddenly, at the sound of the mingled voices, the animals were stricken with curiosity. What could be happening in there? Now that, for the first time, animals and human beings were meeting on terms of equality. With one accord, they began to creep as quietly as possible to the farmhouse garden. At the gate they paused, half frightened to go on, but Clover led the way in. They tiptoed up to the house, and such animals as were tall enough peered into the dining room window. There, round a long table, sat half a dozen farmers and half a dozen more eminent pigs, so respected, Napoleon himself occupying the seat of honour at the head of the table. The pigs appeared completely at ease in their chairs. The company had been enjoying a game of cards, but had broken off for a moment, evidently in order to drink a toast. A large jug was circulating, and the mugs were being refilled with beer. Nobody noticed the wondering faces of the animals that gazed in at the window. Mr. Pilkington of Foxwood had stood up, his mug in his hand. In a moment, he said, he would ask the present company to drink a toast. But before doing so, there were a few words that he felt incumbent upon him to say. So incumbent means necessary. It was a source of great satisfaction to him, he said, and he was sure to all others present, to feel that a long period of mistrust and misunderstanding had now come to an end. There had been a time, not that he or any of the present company had shared such sentiments, but there had been a time when the respected proprietors of Animal Farm had been regarded, he would not say of hostility, but perhaps of a certain measure of misgiving by their human neighbours. So the proprietors are just the owners. Hostility is sort of unfriendliness. So what Mr. Pilkington is recognising is there was a time when relations between Animal Farm and the human neighbours were not great. And as a consequence, unfortunate incidents had occurred. Mistaken ideas had been current. He had felt that the existence of a farm owned and operated by pigs was somehow abnormal and was liable, so likely, to have an unsettling effect in the neighbourhood. Too many farmers had assumed, without due inquiry, so without really looking into it, that on such a farm a spirit of licence and indiscipline would prevail, so would succeed, would take over. Licence and indiscipline just sort of means freedom, disregard for the rules, indiscipline, so not being disciplined. So just sort of, they assumed it would run riot. There'd be no law and order. They had been nervous about the effects upon their own animals, or even upon their human employees. But all such doubts were now dispelled, so disappeared, they'd gone, the doubts lifted. Today he and his friends had visited Animal Farm and inspected every inch of it with their own eyes. And what did they find? Not only the most up-to-date methods, but a discipline and an orderliness which should be an example to farmers everywhere. He believed that he was right in saying that the lower animals on Animal Farm did more work and received less food than any animal in the country. Indeed, he and his fellow visitors today had observed many features which they intended to introduce on their own farms immediately. So they're really impressed because these pigs have managed to live in a way that has meant that the working class, if you like, in society are hardly being fed and rewarded, but are working incredibly hard so that the pigs can reap all the rewards for themselves. And the humans think that's great. They are going to try and do the same on their farm. He would end his remarks, he said, by emphasising once again the friendly feelings that subsisted and ought to subsist between Animal Farm and its neighbours. So continued. Between pigs and human beings, there was not and there need be any clash of interest whatsoever. Their struggles and their difficulties were one, Was not the labour problem the same everywhere? Here it became apparent that Mr. Pilkington was about to spring to some carefully prepared witticisms, so jokes, on the company, but for a moment he was too overcome by amusement to be able to utter it. After much choking, during which his various chins turned purple, he managed to get out, "If you have your lower animals to contend with," he said, "we have our lower classes." This bon mot set the table in a roar, and Mr. Pilkington once again congratulated the pigs on the low rations, the long working hours, and the general absence of pampering which he had observed on Animal Farm. So, that is just a joke. That bon mot is just a joke, he thinks. And now, he said finally, he would ask the company to rise to their feet and make certain that their glasses were full. "Gentlemen," concluded Mr. Pilkington, "gentlemen, I give you a toast to the prosperity of Animal Farm." There was enthusiastic cheering and stamping of feet. Napoleon was so gratified, so pleased, that he left his place and came round to the table to clink his mug against Mr. Pilkington's before emptying it. When the cheering had died down, Napoleon, who had remained on his feet, intimated that he too had a few words to say, so he suggested. Like all of Napoleon's speeches, it was short and to the point. He too, he said, was happy that the period of misunderstanding was at an end. For a long time there had been rumours circulated, he had reason to think, by some malignant enemy, evil, that there was something subversive and even revolutionary in the outlook of himself and his colleagues, so subversive, disruptive. They'd been credited with attempting to stir up rebellion among the animals on neighbouring farms. Nothing could be further from the truth. Their sole wish, now and in the past, was to live at peace and in normal business relations with their neighbours. This farm, which he had the honour to control, he added, was a cooperative enterprise. The title deeds which were in his possession were owned by the pigs jointly. He did not believe, he said, that any of the old suspicions still lingered, but certain changes had been made recently in the routine of the farm, which should have the effect of promoting confidence further. Hitherto, said previously, the animals on the farm had a rather foolish custom of addressing one another as comrade. This was to be suppressed. There had also been a very strange custom, whose origin was unknown, of marching every Sunday past a boar's skull which was nailed to a post in the garden. This too would be suppressed, and the skull had already been buried. His visitors might have observed too the green flag which flew from the masthead. If so, they would perhaps have noticed that the white hoof and horn with which it had been previously marked had now been removed, and it would be a plain green flag from now onwards. Remember, that horn and that hoof were symbols of sort of that animal equality, that it was all animals in it together for the sake of the farm. So it's symbolic that that is removed. He had only one criticism, he said, to make of Mr. Pilkington's excellent and neighbourly speech. Mr. Pilkington had referred throughout to Animal Farm. He could not, of course, know, for he, Napoleon, was only now for the first time announcing it, that the name Animal Farm had been abolished. So henceforward, so going forward in future, the farm was to be known as Manor Farm, which he believed was its correct and original name. "Gentlemen," concluded Napoleon, "I will give you the same toast as before, but in a different form. Fill your glasses to the brim. Gentlemen, here is my toast to the prosperity of the Manor Farm." There was the same hearty cheering as before, and the mugs were emptied to the dregs. But as the animals outside gazed at the scene, it seemed to them that some strange thing was happening. What was it that had altered in the faces of the pigs? Clover's old, dim eyes flitted from one face to another. Some of them had 5 chins, some had 4, some had 3. But what was it that seemed to be melting and changing? Then, the applause having come to an end, the company took up their cards and continued the game that had been interrupted, and the animals crept silently away. But they had not gone 20 yards when they stopped short. An uproar of voices was coming from the farmhouse. They rushed back and looked through the window again. Yes, a violent quarrel was in progress. There were shoutings, bangings on the table, sharp suspicious glances, furious denials. The source of the trouble appeared to be that Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington had each played the ace of spades simultaneously. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. Okay, so that is the end. So final things, there are appendices here, which, especially if you're in Grammar Stream or Set 1, I would say would be really interesting for you to read through. And if you don't find them interesting, at least useful, I think really helps contextualise the novella and what was inspiring Orwell to write it and what was going through his head based on his observations in society. If you do find the themes interesting, again, I think this is probably more targeted at Set 1 or Grammar Stream. If you want, another little challenge might be to see if you can get hold of a copy of 1984. It was also written by Orwell and has very similar themes and ideas about government and the corruption within government and how we're all controlled. It is a lot longer than Animal Farm, maybe 3 times the length. And it is a really challenging read, but I think also amazing if you can actually access that. There are lots of Spark Notes and things online that you could use. Look into that. There are 2 more bullet points then to add on to your list for everybody before the end of the video. So pause the video to get them down if you need to. So the pigs make peace with their human neighbours who are impressed with the hard work and low rations given to the animals. And then that final thing that occurs, the sound of arguing brings the animals to the farmhouse windows. When the pigs peer in, they cannot tell the pigs from the men. Okay, so make sure you get those 2 notes down and then do your final little knowledge quiz. And there will be, as ever, a couple of added activities available on ePraise if you want something extra to do.